As a native Black American and a proud member of the Muscogee Creek Nation, I understand the importance of tracing your lineage. Help me help you discover your roots with a personalized genealogy consultation. Paper trail genealogy matters. DNA tests can't prove ethnicity or tribal affiliation. You must search through paper records to dive deep into your family heritage. During the meeting, I will teach you how to navigate the genealogy process with ease. You'll learn how to link tribal affiliation with your ancestors, and I'll show you the step-by-step process I went through to gaining tribal citizenship. Take the first step to unlocking your past. To book a consultation, send an email to mike@keymediapro.com.
You get genealogy consultation, I highly recommend Mike. You know, he was very thorough, prompt, very knowledgeable. Even taught me some stuff about the background of Indian ancestry and heritage that I didn't know. The biggest piece of it is he taught me how to pull records and really dig into those records to make sure that I have things to match up to be able to take back for my citizenship. So I really appreciate everything he does. Highly recommend Mike as your genealogist.
The Flicks Tape.
They have no future as they have no past. Tomorrow as today, slavery will be their only possible privilege.
We gods, man. We kings, man. We lords.
I was born black, I live black, and I'm gonna die probably because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head.
This is the remix. My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American.
Aborigine, which means what? Black folks. But you never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. Two Latin words, ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
Great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance along with everybody else has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. That the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity.
Remember that big Indian dude in that movie? Mm-hmm. He was cool. And then he couldn't talk unless he was talking about gum.
Yeah. You know, I think you're not supposed to say Indian either.
No way, really?
Yeah. I think you're supposed to call them African Americans.
Oh, you're shoemakers now. And more importantly, you're a person of color. You're no longer a Nipmuc person. And that shows through in these county histories and also in the census records at the time. You find a person described in the 1860 census as an Indian. In the 1870 census, they're described as a person of color or a colored person. Same person, but the census taker, as part of the white dominant society, decides that this person is no longer Nipmuc.
Since y'all always screaming about DNA, watch what the biology professor says about DNA. Watch this.
Smith's breakdown from Ancestry showed 97% European and 2% Asian.
I'm a black girl. I am not a Jewish white lady. I'm black. My parents were black.
She contacted Ancestry with questions, but says a rep told her the results are accurate.
These DNA tests for ethnicity are entertainment value only.
William Gilliland is a biology professor at DePaul. He says DNA kits can be great for connecting family members and finding relatives, but the science for ethnicity testing isn't as concrete.
There's nothing that confident for ethnicity. There's no diagnostic nucleotide. You can say this person is from Europe, this person's from Africa.
You see that? DNA can't tell you where you're from. A scholar tells the truth. Watch this.
But many African Americans, you are the Native Americans. You're not even African Americans, you're Native Americans. You're the ones that they brought blankets with, was it smallpox or whatever diseases, and wiped out entire communities because they said they came in peace, but they actually came in war. And they are still warring us right until this day. So there are those beloveds of you who really don't feel any connection to Mama Africa. And this is just, you know, a confirmation, a reassurance that America belongs to you.
So Africans know this history, but nobody else does. Come on, make it make sense.
At me. And so with the help of my wife, we extracted enough saliva to send off in the mail. We were so excited to see the results. After about 3 months, we were shocked. My lizard was 51% Ashkenazi Jewish. It was also 40% West Asian. This was really interesting. They also gave us a little bit of his background and his history, what he liked to eat, etc. Let us know which animal's DNA we should send in next.
You don't have to try to be something you're not. Trying to be something I'm not? Trying to be proud of my African heritage? That's being something I'm not, then fine. My grandmother was a full-blooded Iroquois. I know all of that, Mama. They know this. I am alive because of the blood of a people who never scraped or begged or apologized for what they were. They asked only one thing of this world, to be allowed to be. It broke my heart when you changed your name. I gave you my grandmother's name, a woman who bore 9 children and educated them all. Who held off 6 white men with a shotgun when they tried to drag one of her sons off to jail for not knowing his place. And you had to reach into an African dictionary to find a name that would make you proud.
My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American. Making music would've thought I had help, but the Indians I know wanna be the chief they self.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let me get some fists and feathers in the chat if you can hear me loud, crisp, and clear, and we'll get this party started. Smash the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the Cash App or the PayPal if you support the mission, and let's get on with the show. I want to do this live stream to really give praise and honor to some of our ancestors that do have African lineage. That's right, guys. Some of us, very few of us, a very small minority percentage of us do have African lineage. You know, the transatlantic slave trade is not a conspiracy. It really happened. And although over 40% of the slaves went to the Caribbean and over 60% of the slaves went to South America, 4% of those slaves did come to North America. And we still refer to them as Native Black Americans because those slaves, when they rebelled, when they revolted, when they burnt down the plantations and they fled and they warred on their white oppressor, guess where they went for safe haven? To the indigenous tribes. They were accepted. They were allowed to assimilate, intermarry, adopt their culture and their customs. So for those of us that do descend from the 4% of the African slaves that came to North America, well, riddle me this, put yourself in their shoe. Do you think they want to hold on to some weird, distant tie to Africa 400 years ago, them backwards ass bush baby inbred motherfuckers that sold their fellow African to the white man for trinkets? Or do you think they would have more pride and honor with their more recent ancestry and their Aboriginal connection? Now, we're going to actually get into a specific tribe known as the Seminoles. The name Seminole comes from Spanish Seminole, which means runaway. When you hear about the 5 civilized tribes, when you hear about Native Americans having slaves, it really wasn't what you think of when you think of slavery. It wasn't no Roots 12 Years a Slave type shit. oftentimes, which we're going to learn here today, is the blacks were free and equal. Those African slaves were free and equal to their indigenous counterparts. But the white man still called them a slave in the history books. The white man actually tried to force the tribal members to give up those African slaves and send them back to the plantation. And guess what? They revolted. They had the Seminole Wars. They had conflicts. Those Aboriginals went to bat, pulled up arms in defense of those African slaves, and they said they are not going back to the plantation. They are a part of us. They are a part of our tribe. So when we talk about African lineage and African heritage, some of us, very few of us, do have that. Some of us are a part of the 4% that came here, but even that 4% mixed in and were accepted and adopted into indigenous tribes. And today we're going to talk about not just the Seminoles, not just the Black Seminoles, but the Black warrior Seminoles. These folks were giving the Europeans hell. These folks were standing on business. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at a little piece of Untold history. At a certain point in time, I will drop the StreamYard link if anybody wants to call in and provide some commentary. Let's go.
Dub Warrior is a Black Seminole. He is descended from Africans who escaped slavery and united with the Seminole Indians in Florida more than 2 centuries ago.
There's no future without a past. It's a fact. You're coming from nowhere, you're going nowhere.
1776. 13 American colonies rebel against British rule, but Florida remains loyal to England. The river dividing Georgia and Florida becomes an international border. Hundreds of blacks enslaved on American plantations escaped south, finding refuge and allies among the Seminole Indians in northern Florida. Enraged.
Come on, y'all, riddle me this. Those Seminoles that have African descent, African heritage, do you think they give a damn about the dope fiend crackhead parents of theirs that sold them into child slavery? Or do you think they care about their adoptive family that took them in and fought to keep them free? I wonder, even the few of us that have African lineage, do y'all really think we holding on to that distant lineage, or we rocking with the Aboriginals that rocked with us and never sold us out, stayed true?
Slave owners enlist the United States government to destroy the Black and Seminole alliance. But in 50 years of fighting, the bond between Black and Seminole is not broken.
Come on, I had a dumbass troll in my comment section earlier today, left a comment on a video, said, "Hey, Mike, I've done a lot of research and I've never seen any of these black tribes you speak of." Well, I hope you're watching right now.
Charlie Wilson is dedicated to passing on the history of her Seminole ancestors.
so many blacks were in slavery, and we would say died for being black, and we survived.
The heritage of these black Seminoles is unique. Their existence as a people proves that whites failed to destroy the alliance they most feared.
They knew if there was ever a joint effort that they wouldn't be able to control. They couldn't control either race, the black or the Indian.
The Indians were skilled, but then you had your blacks, some of them were domesticated by the whites. They knew their ways, they knew their weaknesses. So together, what do you get? A formidable foe, because they're stronger together.
American slave owners feared the united strength of the Africans they had enslaved and the Indians whose land they had stolen. This combined African and Indian force soon became Florida's best defense against American invaders. A 1783 treaty ended the American Revolution. Control of Florida returned to Spain, the territory's original colonial ruler. As the Spanish moved into St. Augustine, the Americans demanded the return of escaped slaves, but the Spanish had other plans.
Anytime, day or night, step out and see what was taking place.
Historian Jane Landers discovered records documenting that the Spanish encouraged a military alliance between blacks and Indians.
Sometimes you will see on the list detachments of the Free Black militias specifically posted out at Indian villages. The Black and Indian militias were the military force on the frontier. So the Spanish would be negotiating at diplomatic levels with the United States, but they would send out the Indians and the blacks to do the fighting. And the Free Blacks in St. Augustine were very connected many times to the blacks that were living in the Seminole villages. What we now call the Seminoles were living in their own villages, for instance, very large settlements near what is now Gainesville, Florida, in the Alachua Savannah area.
A close relationship developed between Seminoles and blacks on this prairie. Some white observers mistakenly assumed the blacks were slaves to the Seminoles.
It really was not a...
What did they just say? Did y'all catch that? Did y'all just hear that? They just said that the white observers mistook the black Seminoles as slaves. Guys, do you understand why it's so important to trace your family heritage now? Guess what? The Seminoles, on paper, let the Europeans tell his version of history, right? They said the Seminoles were part of the 5 civilized tribes who held slaves. Well, what the white man calls slaves, you'll find, are actually free black people, but they just can't stand the notion of free black people, so they still label them slaves in the records. Do you see why it's important to do your genealogy? You may have ancestors that are on the Seminole tribe's roll, listed as freedmen. You would assume that means that they were a slave of the Seminole, but it's saying right here, the Seminoles didn't have no black slaves. They had black brothers. The Europeans mistook them for slaves.
Between Seminoles and blacks on this prairie. Some white observers mistakenly assumed the blacks were slaves to the Seminoles.
It really was not a slave-master relationship. It was more a free existence. They intermarried. The children were accepted in the tribes quite easily, and they had a common interest in wanting to hold that land where they were living freely. They had acquired big herds of cattle themselves. They had nice fields and homes.
But Georgian slave owners raged against the Black and Seminole alliance. They demanded that the U.S. government capture the former slaves and their children, even if it meant invading Spanish Florida, which they did in 1812.
Blacks and Indians fought so fiercely and with such determination that they routed the Georgians who were invading Florida. They even fought and defeated a U.S. Marine contingent that was assisting those Georgians.
But within a few months, the Georgians were back with fresh troops. They invaded the prairie, pillaged the towns, burned hundreds of log homes. These few excavated remains tell of a settled life destroyed forever.
Come on, y'all. Peep game, peep game, peep game. So the Europeans classify the blacks with the Seminoles as slaves, but what is actually going on in reality is that the Seminole Indians and the African slaves that are now part of the Seminole tribe, they're actively fighting against making black Seminole slaves. The white man says they're slaves, but actually they're killing the white man to try to preserve the black Seminoles' freedom. This is why we can't trust their version of history. Do you understand?
The Seminoles scattered south. Many of the black Seminoles disappeared to a place where the invading Americans would not find them for a long time.
The Seminoles were pretty well crippled and dispersed in a number of different directions, beginning in about 1813. One of the spots they came, I think, was in this vicinity here.
This map, drawn more than 150 years ago in the diary of an American military engineer, led anthropologist Brent Wiseman to this remote location on the Withlacoochee River. The diary's author, Henry Prince, called this place Boggy Island.
We're now in the middle of Boggy Island, high and dry, in the midst of river swamp all around. This is the area described by Henry Prince as being cleared and cultivated by the black Seminoles during the Second Seminole War period. It was in this area here, now overgrown as a very beautiful mesic hammock, that the black Seminoles grew corn, beans, several varieties of squash, pumpkins, and along the edge of the river, sugarcane. We know very little about how these black Seminoles were living. We don't know what their settlement looked like. We don't know anything about their daily lives. On the other hand, we have a very informative historical resource below our feet, a relatively undisturbed archaeological site out here somewhere, waiting to be further explored. And it's quite possible that archaeology will hold the key to developing a real history of these black Seminoles in Florida.
The black Seminoles at Boggy Island stayed out of sight, while another group of blacks occupied this highly visible spot, the location of what was called Negro Fort on the Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida. The British built this fort during the War of 1812. They retreated in 1814 and left the fort and extensive artillery to blacks and Indians settled along the river. American slave owners detested this evidence of black strength so close to their plantations. Young General Andrew Jackson ordered the fort destroyed, regardless of the ground it stands on.
Yes, President Andrew Jackson, general, then becomes president in later years. The motherfucker on our money is responsible for destroying black Seminole encampments. Come on, y'all. Do you understand it's so paramount for us to look into history under our own accord, under our own fruition, because we can't trust the version of his story.
This was a really good consultation. If you're curious about your Native American history, this brother knows what he's talking about. He has a wealth of knowledge, wealth of information, and his prices is legit. So book a consultation, go through the process, and see what comes out on the other side.
Mike is the real deal. His information is real. He's a humble brother, and he's all about the information. He's not about, personal gain or personal applause, personal credit. This is about our nation. It's not about one individual, but it's about us collectively as a people. And Mike is all about that, So we stand behind the brother 100%.
If you have any doubt, get it out your head immediately. So yeah, like I'm going to continue to work with Mike as much as I can. So I want to say thank you, Mike, for actually taking the time out and talk with me and my husband. Like you definitely informed us on a lot of things. And the people out there that's watching, he will also inform you on a lot of things that you may not even know about. So I want to say thank you again, Mike.
On July 27, 1814, a lucky shot from an American frigate hit the fort's magazine. The explosion killed almost 300 blacks and Indians. In 1817, Jackson invaded Spanish Florida with the excuse of routing out blacks and Indians. The Spanish didn't stop the Americans, and by 1821, Florida belonged to the United States. New settlers pushed into Florida, demanding more and more of the valuable Seminole lands. Violence between settlers and Seminoles continued, even after the U.S. government restricted the Seminoles to a reservation. Slave catchers made a living kidnapping black Seminoles. As president, Andrew Jackson demanded that all Seminoles be removed west and that all black Seminoles be sold into slavery. The Seminoles refused.
So on the one hand, they say the blacks were the slaves of the Seminole, but on the other hand, they're refusing to make the black Seminoles slaves. Guys, both can't be true at the same damn time. Which version of the story do you choose to believe?
Thousands of U.S. troops occupied the Florida territory. By 1835, the Seminole resistance galvanized into war.
The older ancestors, they used to tell us about that when I was a kid. And they said that they fought down there in the Seminole War for 7 years.
The significance of the Negro presence in the first place was that it was a basic cause of the war. The erection of these forts, Foster and certain others, I think indicated beyond any doubt to the Indians that the United States wanted in the long run to push them out, because several of the forts, like Fort Foster, were in the reservation, and there wouldn't be any basic purpose in having the forts in the reservation.
So basically what he's saying is that they already pushed the Seminoles, the black Seminoles included, onto a reservation, but because there's unity between the blacks or the recently freed African slaves, or runaway slaves, I shall say, because there's a coalition, because there's a unity, a bond between the blacks and the Indians, they want to go onto the reservation and break them up. So look how greasy, look how grimy, look how devious. All because what? They can't stand some free black folks being united with some free Indians.
If you were going to leave the Indians in it, leave them alone. The constant leakage of slaves from South Carolina, Georgia, down here so aggravated the slaveholders that they were determined to wipe out this refuge. The blacks were among the more important guides. They were the sole interpreters. There wasn't anybody else who could interpret. And as warriors, as long as they were on the Indian side, the people at the time always stated that the blacks were as good fighters as the Indians, if not better. And so their significance is major.
I think you would find that the freedmen was the one that was doing most of the fight. And they fought to be free.
The High Command, Jessup, changed his position several times. At one point, he said every slave that can be demonstrated to have belonged to a white has to go back to the whites. And if the Indians don't turn them in, we'll hang anyone who wasn't turned in or who didn't turn them in. But Jessup's end position, after several flip-flops.
And as we talk about the history, the legacy of the Seminole Freedmen, we got to give a huge shout out to the Freedmen's Network. Thanks for stopping by, brother. Y'all make sure to check out this brother's podcast, the Freedmen Network Affairs Radio on Spotify and iHeart. The link is in the chat.
We aren't going to make slave catchers out of the United States Army.
The Seminoles fought until the U.S. government agreed that the black Seminoles would also be allowed to go west.
Damn, so the Seminoles were banging on the white boys. They was banging on them. They said, no, it's up and it's stuck. We're going to fight, bleed, and die and kill you until you allow us to take our free black folks with us. We ain't going west of the Mississippi. We ain't going to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory, unless you allow us to take our black tribal members with us. So, guys, for those of us that are descendants of the 4% of African slaves that came to North America, what do you think they hold more dear to them? The African lineage that betrayed them and sold them to the Europeans for trinkets, or the Aboriginal inhabitants of America that adopted them and took them in and fought and bled and died right alongside them to preserve their freedom?
While some Seminoles never left the Florida swamps, the majority of Seminoles, Indian and black, sailed from Tampa Bay up the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers to Indian Territory. Here, Seminoles joined thousands of southeastern Indians forced west by the U.S. government.
And shout out to Tom. Tom says the label is black if you don't claim your black Seminole heritage in court. Yeah, you know, it's interesting that the Moorish sovereign citizen folks want to run around talking about sovereignty. For better or for worse, Indian tribes do have sovereignty. You can actually, quote unquote, have your status corrected. Guys, when I got my citizenship and went through the process, the same process that I actively take people through every week, when we went through this, it changed my designation on the census. My passport, my driver's license, my birth certificate, it no longer says black. It now says American Indian. But unless you trace your heritage and unless you, I'm sorry that I'm using these terms because they've kind of been demonized by these sovereign citizen weirdos online. But unless you correct your status and trace your heritage, then you just got to be black. And, you know, fresh off the boat, African bush baby tethers, they come over here and they don't call them immigrants. They don't call them African Americans. They just call them black people. If anyone's an African American, it should be those Africans. But we're mislabeled with misnomers like black and African American unless we got our paperwork in check.
This countryside now bears the name of Seminole County, Oklahoma. It is headquarters for the Seminole Nation in the West. Twin brothers, Lawrence and Lance Cudjoe, stay deeply involved in the affairs of the Seminole Nation, even while Lance recovers from a severe stroke. Their ancestor, King Cudjoe, was a translator and advisor to the Seminoles in Florida.
Have a seat. Finally made it.
Lawrence meets with Seminole Chief Tanyan. They prepare for a council meeting later that night.
And whichever the way this person votes, that's the way they're going to go.
That's Cudjoe.
Yeah.
Lawrence Cudjoe.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma, black Seminoles are called Seminole freedmen. Two of the 14 tribal bands of the Seminole Nation are freedmen bands. Seminole freedmen have full tribal status, unlike any other group of blacks associated with Native peoples.
Yes, guys, fun fact. The Treaty of 1866 was when the government told the tribes that quote unquote held slaves, or really just had black people amongst them, that they had to free them and make them full citizens and give them full benefits. Some of the tribes said no, and they discriminated against the freedmen. One of the tribes that rocked out for the freedmen were the Seminoles. The Seminoles gave them full citizenship, full tribal benefits, like the Treaty of 1866 stipulated. Some tribes, like my tribe, the Muscogee Creek Nation, they discriminate against the freedmen. The Choctaw Nation, they discriminate against the freedmen. And those freedmen are going to court to this day. They just had a court hearing last month with Congress to try to get their status restored and get citizenship and all the benefits thereof. But the Seminoles never discriminated against their black tribal members listed as freedmen.
When they had that brutal war in Florida, the freedmen were so well tied with the Seminole tribe that they adopted them, made them full citizens of Seminole Nation. And their constitution was a lot different than the Creeks and a lot of the rest of them, because they really were blood brothers. In fact, there was a lot of intermarrying in that tribe.
Ben Warrior is the head of the Doser Barkus Band. Ben Warrior's ancestors came to Indian Territory as independent tribal members to farm the land and live free.
When the government made an agreement with the freedmen to cease fighting and come to Oklahoma with the Indians, the freedmen made agreement that they would come, but they had to come with their guns on. So you see, the freedmen came here with their guns on. And they said the freedmen were slave to the Indian, but slaves don't wear no gun.
Exactly. Listen to the elder. They classified them as slaves. They said, oh, these black folks with the Seminoles are just slaves, but they refused to go to Oklahoma Indian Territory unless they had pistols on them. What slaves you know travel with guns on some Django type shit? Get that nigga off that No. Nuh-uh. He stay up on that horse if he a Seminole. Let's talk about it, y'all. Let's talk about it.
But in 1839, when the Florida Seminoles first arrived at Fort Gibson on the Arkansas River, slave catchers were close behind. Many black Seminoles stayed at the fort and built this commissary for the government. The Army protected them from slave catchers, but still called them slaves.
Guys, when I do the paper trail genealogy research with my clients, guess what? We find ancestors of theirs that were listed as freedmen. We find ancestors of theirs that were listed as slaves, but that don't mean that's the lifestyle they was living. Did you know some slaves had pistols? And if a European tried to subjugate them, they killed them and went to war with them for several years? Oh, that's a hell of a lifestyle for a slave, huh? Guys, just because you do your genealogy and your ancestors were freedmen or your ancestors were slaves, that does not mean African. And even a lot of these black Seminoles were Aboriginals that were relabeled as African and with other misnomers and false titles. But a lot of the Africans that did come to North America, when they fled the plantation, they went to the Seminole tribe in Florida because they knew that was a safe haven. So you've got a mix. You got black Indians with no African admixture. You got black Indians with African admixture and everything in between. But guys, put a 1 in the chat. Nah, fuck that. Put some fists and feathers in the chat if you didn't realize that some of our ancestors who were listed as slaves on records were actually living totally free. Freer than you and me. You may live in a state that doesn't have open. Our ancestors was open carrying with it in the 1800s.
The persecution continued. In 1849, blacks among the Seminoles were legally declared slaves. In defiance, Seminole war hero John Horse and his partner Wildcat rebelled. They led 300 followers out of Indian Territory into Mexico.
They chose Mexico, I imagine, because it was supposed to be free over there. They could do what you wanted. If they had stayed over here, they'd be back in slavery again.
The Seminoles lived near the Rio Grande for 20 years, where they served as border patrol for the Mexican government. The Seminoles' expertise as horsemen and sharpshooters made an impression, even on the American side of the river, where they were still considered slaves. Soon after the Civil War abolished slavery in the United States, the U.S. Army recruited the Seminoles as border scouts. They were stationed here at Fort Clark, Texas. The Army promised wages and land.
Come on,
They came
y'all.
over
Come
here
on,
to
y'all.
help the United
Come
States
on, y'all.
government.
Wait a minute. Foul on the
In
play.
18
Foul on the play. Foul on the play. This is a tale as old as time. The U.S. government wants to persecute us and then later on ask us to win battles for them. They did that in the Revolutionary War, in the Seminole War, and now we're learning how they did that in the Indian Wars. We already heard how they persecuted the Seminoles, tried to make them slaves. They had to battle them for 7 years. Then they tried to force them west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma Indian Territory. They said, we're not going unless our black Seminoles go with us. All that shit for the U.S. government to come around and be like, hey, so we need your help fighting the other Indian tribes. So can you come be scouts for us in our army? And we promise we'll treat you better than before.
1970 to form the scouts, scout for the government. That's why they came back. And they promised them land and that they would take care of them. And each man that came over and they used him as a scout would get the same pay as a private. And then they would let the rest of the family stay on the land. But the guys that were scouts would take care of the rest of the people, as the families. And that's the way they did. They stayed together. And if I had, you had.
The Seminole Scouts served the U.S. government for 34 years. They earned 3 Congressional Medals of Honor. Descendants of the Seminole Scouts had to obtain permission to visit this land at Fort Clark, where their parents and grandparents once had homes.
And the road to the cemetery is right up above.
That's right. Just back down over in that. Now it's changed so much I hardly. Isn't it pathetic?
Fine.
The Army kept them there until they thought it was peaceful enough. Then after they figured they didn't need them any longer, well, they just put them off, told them they had to leave. And I learned that, of course, there would be some dissensions about it because they had never thought of it, had never thought they would ever have to leave. They had established their homes and was getting along comfortably.
Fort Clark is no longer a military base, but a private residential club.
When they first opened up, you paid to go in the gates to get down on the reservation and all. And that was one of the reasons why I joined, because I felt that I was born down there. That's our land. And they shouldn't have taken it. And there is a bit of bitterness.
Seminole Scout families lost their Fort Clark homes, while Seminole freedmen in Oklahoma were being swindled out of land allotted to them from the original Seminole reservation.
Guys, do you understand how badly they fucked over our ancestors? They flee the plantation, get adopted in by the Seminole tribes. The government's like, hey, no, Seminoles, give those black folks up. They're slaves. They're slaves. They say, no, we're going to fight you for 7 years. While they're fighting them actively, they're slave catchers stealing the black Seminoles and sending them to plantations. They rebel. They win wars. Some of them end up succeeding, going to Oklahoma, Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi. Some people like John Horse fought to the end. They went to Mexico. They were allotted land in Mexico and became border patrol for the Mexican government. But those that relocated to Oklahoma, that was supposed to be Indian Territory with no white folks, later the white folks come and through land lotteries and illegal schemes, some legal schemes as well, they steal the Indian Territory from the Indians. You push the Indians to the middle of nowhere, to the desert to die, basically. And then later on, you still come and take your land. What? And then they co-opt and convince some of the Black Seminoles to work for the government that previously oppressed them to help them win the Indian Wars and to be scout leaders? And then those families of the scout leaders get their land taken? And then the freedmen who get land allotments in Oklahoma still get their land taken? And then modern day, the descendants of these people don't even know that's their ancestral legacy. And they think that they're African Americans and they come from Africa. All right. Talk about it.
The justification for the allotment of reservations was that American Indians would not be able to become, quote unquote, civilized until they were taught the value of private ownership of land.
Peep game. We had communal ownership of land. We did not acknowledge private ownership of land. And that is what the Europeans despised the most, because guess what? If we have free, sovereign, communal land, hundreds of thousands of acres, undisturbed, natural, living in equilibrium with our environment, living in natural harmony, natural accord, well, guess what? What do the Europeans really want? They want the situation we're in today. Modern day, the American government taxes every single parcel of land. You can't tax every single little individual acre and square meter of land unless you split it up into individual land allotments. So even when they sent the Indians to die in the desert of Oklahoma, they give them big swaths of land, hundreds of thousands of acres. And then when they come and they're trying to get some white settlers to create the state of Oklahoma, they start forcing them off of their tribal land, off of their regional land, into individual privatized land allotments. And then once you have your own privatized parcel, once they give you your 40 acres and a mule, they can swindle you out of your individual parcel. And then whoever the new owner is, they can tax individually. And now they're taxing every square inch of this country.
Anthropologist Rebecca Bateman spent a year conducting research among the freedmen in Seminole County.
In 1897, a tribal roll was created in which the attempt was made to list all of the Indian and freedmen members of the tribe in preparation for preparing the allotment roll.
They paid $10 to get on the roll, I hear. And if you came from Florida with Seminole Indians or your ancestors and they were on the rolls, well, come on down by lineal descent, and they allocated land. We got the map name. Everybody they issued that land to. Some of them did real well because he got land that had oil reserves on it. Of course, that land has gotten away. We had some of the same conditions they had down in Florida, where they just told people to.
That's right. They forced them to the Oklahoma desert just to find out the land is rich in oil. So now they want to steal the land. Come on. Come on. Let's talk about it. How you give reparations, then steal reparations. It don't make sense. And that wasn't even no real reparations. That wasn't even no real rectification. It's just so low down, so egregious. And unfortunately, oftentimes, the only way for us to have tribal recognition and citizenship is if our ancestors, for better or for worse, got along to go along and signed up on the Dawes roll so they can get their individual land allotment.
Just hold them out of deed and told people to get off the land they own, you know.
There was a massive grab for land by white speculators who did so by taking advantage of the illiterate allottees, both Indian and Black, but particularly the freedmen.
See, there's a lot of things that she found in the documents that was extremely negative. It made the state look bad. That shouldn't be brought out. That's why it's not in the history books. They're not gonna put it in the history books where how they got over a lot of this land, they're not gonna put that in the history books.
People today, especially elderly people, some of whom are old enough to have been original allottees, they remember this period very well.
Helen Thurman, born in 1902, was listed on the allotment rolls as a newborn.
Now, which is which?
That's Lance.
I'm Lance. He's Lance. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Y'all come in.
Yeah.
I've got a good far.
I'm a newborn. You were newborn.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
All the newborns just got 40 acres of land. But
Yeah.
some got 60s, the older ones, first class land. They got 60 acres.
60.
Come on, y'all. You may not even realize that you have familial land that was allotted to you and your ancestors. We don't know what we don't know until we go through the paper trail.
The genealogy consultation, I highly recommend Mike. You know, he was very thorough, prompt, very knowledgeable. Even taught me some stuff about the background of Indian ancestry and heritage that I didn't know. The biggest piece of it was he taught me how to pull records and really dig into those records to make sure that I have things to match up to be able to take back for my citizenship. So I really appreciate everything he does, and I highly recommend Mike as your genealogist.
Guys, we must do the work. We must look through the records. Matter of fact, perfect example. This is how accessible these records are nowadays. Let me show you how accessible these documents truly are. Now, most people, unfortunately, do not search properly. And I'm going to give you some game. Normally, this is something that I cover during one of my personal one-on-one consultations, but I'm going to give you some game, okay? The game is meant to be told and not always sold, but let's talk about it for a moment. Now, most people mess up because they start with the dolls roll. They get the names of ancestors of theirs, they go to the dolls roll, and they start looking up names, right? Well, that's not the way to go about doing things. And the reason why that is not the way to go about doing things is because when you search for your ancestors on the dolls roll, it's best to search by tribal roll number. And most times when someone does a preliminary search, they just do first and last name. If I search for my own ancestors who I know for a fact are on the dolls roll, if I search for last name, they're not going to pop up. It's really hit or miss. Really, really, really hit or miss. So what you got to do is you've got to search by tribal roll number. And in order to get that tribal roll number, the first thing you have to do is trace your family tree. I did my family tree through Ancestry.com. On my father's side, I took it all the way back to the 1830s. On my mother's side, we taken it all the way back to the late 1700s. But if we go to my most recent ancestor that was on the dolls roll, my most recent lineal ancestor, that's going to be Pleasant Tobler. But if you search on the dolls roll, just type in Pleasant, just type in Tobler. Either A, it'll say no results found, or B, there may be multiple names that pop up. So what you've got to do is search by the roll number, if known, right? If known. Well, this is how you get that roll number. After you do a family tree through Ancestry.com, you come over here to the American Indian Records database. And this is a simple way that you can search literally dozens of different Native American data collections: census rolls, Montana rolls, Cherokee muster rolls, land allotment sales, Creek equalization, Indian archives, tribes, chiefs, and treaties. The list goes on and on and on. And if you already have your family tree built through Ancestry.com, and again, I said family tree built. I didn't say mouth swab. I didn't say DNA test. Two different things. Genealogy has nothing to do with DNA. We ain't spitting in no cups around here. If you go to type in the name of one of your ancestors on your family tree, like I start typing in Pleasant, well, look, it's going to give me a suggestion right here. Hey, do you mean Pleasant Tobler? Born 1903. If I click on the blue area right here, it's going to auto-populate whatever they already have on the tree: his birth, his death, his mother, his father, etc., right? So then when I come down here and click search, if there's any Native American records like land allotments, like we're talking about, right? Land allotments, tribal citizenship cards, it should pop up. And what do we have here? We've got many different documents popping up. We've got land allotments. We've got roll cards. Let's start with the first one. We actually have digitized documents that have been scanned. If we click view right now, we are now looking at a Creek newborn card handwritten for one of my lineal ancestors, March 3rd, 1905. This is how deep we can get with it. This is how deep we can go. Come on, I'm mixing the education with the entertainment. Let's talk about it. Now, again, when you see documents like this, what you want, what you really need is this roll number, because then if I take this roll number 1017, I take this over to the Dawes roll and type 1017 in the roll number section. Do some scrolling, and what do you know? Pleasant Tobler. He's listed on the Dawes roll as 2 years old, male, blood quantum is 1/2. There's his roll number again, and he's listed as a Creek by blood newborn. And just like in the video, the documentary film about the Black Seminoles, they were talking about land allotments. Well, you know what? In the American Indian Records database, I thought I saw something that said land allotments. Let's see what that is. Oklahoma and Indian Territory U.S. land allotment jackets for the 5 civilized tribes. Let's view this document. Look at this. 1905, Act of Congress approved, Pleasant Tobler. Let's see what this is about. Fred Tobler is his father. You are hereby advised that on January 4th, 1906, the Secretary of the Interior approved the enrollment of your minor child, Pleasant Tobler, as a citizen by blood of the Creek Nation, and that the name of said child appears upon the roll of newborn citizens of the Creek Nation as number 1017. The child is now entitled to an allotment. Weren't we talking about land allotments earlier? The child is now entitled to an allotment, and application therefore should be made without delay at the land office for the nation in which the prospective allotment is located. The entire allotment for said child must be selected at the time of the original application. And guys, unfortunately, we already know how the story goes. We already know how dire the story ends, because even though they had us sign up on Dawes rolls and they, switched us from regional land ownership to privatized land allotments, they still tricked us out of our land allotments. I don't know if they did that specifically with my family, but they did that with a lot of Black Indians. Well, but let me see if there's any more documents here. Oh, look, this is showing the actual lot of land. Township 15, range number 12. Okay. So this is the actual land that is being allotted. Guys, this is how deep we can get with the paper trail. This is how deep we can get with the research. And this is why I provide those personalized genealogy consultations. But before we wrap up this stream and get on to the next one, we do have a live caller coming from the back to the front. Is Shinir. I'm not sure. I'm probably butchering the name. But let us know where you're calling in from and what's on your mind.
Hi, yes. I actually found you. I was actually on a live feed the other night. You were on Afridamus, and we were talking about Chinidu, and we were talking about what happened to her in South Africa. Do you remember that?
I remember being on Adonis's panel. I don't necessarily remember interacting with you, but
So I found you just because I agreed with you, and I was on there after he took you off.
oh, after I
And
got kicked off, yeah.
Yeah, and then I was on there and I said what I had to say, but I did agree with you and I made my point with him. So I tried my best, because then throughout that conversation, I heard that you were like a podcaster. So I had to do my little deep dive and find you. So I found you, but I'm glad that you're talking on this because I have information to give.
Nice. Well, hey,
On
I'm
this
about to
topic.
wrap up. I'm about to wrap up the stream in like literally 60 seconds, but you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll wrap it up real quick.
Lay it on us
So-
real quick. Yep.
All right. So the knowledge that I do have is that I do have friends, and I have friends of friends from back in the day that can identify, and they are associated with the Aboriginal Indians that were Black in the United States. They come in so many different colors, from like red to having the curly hair to like really, really dark and having the curly hair. I've had friends of mine in school going back. I went down to the Indian Museum also a year ago in Bowling Green, Lower Manhattan, and I was able to see everything. This information was not given in our school books with
And
me
you all,
growing up.
sister, unfortunately, we do have to wrap up the show on that, but that is a very powerful message to leave us with. And I hope that you call in on a future live stream so we can chop it up a little bit longer.
Okay.